and welcome to Conversations on Climate. My name is Chris Caldwell, and this series is produced by United Renewables in collaboration with the London Business School Alumni Energy Club. Today it gives me my great pleasure to introduce Riccardo Gubbioli. Really interesting guy, another London Business School MBA who has transitioned from a background in engineering back into renewable energy and then along into agricultural tech, and where agricultural tech meets carbon capture and storage, carbon sequestration. So really hot topic at the moment, very niche application of a much larger brief. We cover a lot of topics from entrepreneurial journey through to corporate finance in a growing business, a quick look at the technology, a quick look at the science, and some overviews into the challenges that are faced in a business such as this. I found the conversation fascinating, and I'm sure you will too. Riccardo, thanks so much for inviting us into your fantastic offices here and for spending some time with us to talk about your absolutely fascinating journey and ultimately where you are today, which is where carbon capture and storage meets ag tech. Wonderful space, and it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you.
Great.
So, could we start off by just introducing yourself and your journey to this point?
So my name is Riccardo Gubbioli. At the moment, I'm the Director of Corporate Finance for a startup called Raceway. And we are in the, as you said, carbon capture space. But my journey in decarbonization and wider sustainable enterprises started post London Business School when I finished my MBA in 2007, so 15 years ago. And at the time, I joined a private equity investment company. So I was investing in this new thing called renewable energy. Obviously, it wasn't new because it had been around for many years, but the interest was substantial back then. But it's still very much in its infancy. And when I started in 2007, capital cost was very high. There were a lot of government incentives, feed-in tariffs, etc., which made it profitable and interesting for investors to go into that sector, but it was still quite high risk, and there's a lot of development happened. I then sort of was part of that journey through the financial crisis, post-financial crisis, and I saw really the renewable energy industry really changing and becoming from niche on not many people's radars to becoming much more mainstream. And if you think about it, for example, in terms of capital, going from the private equity players, which were looking at higher return, higher risk, to a little bit more stable, a lot of more infrastructure players and IPOs even. So, quite a varied set of investors in the space. And that was roughly the time I then actually changed and left renewable energy industry. And I started where I am now. Actually, I had a couple of years where I was a consultant, and then after that, I started where I am now. And now I'm in a company. The company, we're just about to rebrand. It's our new name, our new corporate identity of last week will be announced next week, but as of last week, we're officially called Brilliant Planet. So that's where I am now.
Very cool. Tell me a little bit about how you feel, before we move on to your current current position and the interesting technologies and experimentation you need to do there, how you feel corporate finance fits into the renewable energy sector, so like your previous job.
The way I've lived it has been, when I think about corporate finance, I really think about different forms of capital, and being your equity capital, your debt capital, potentially grants as well. And then within the equity and the debt, also the in-betweens, mezzanine, structured finance, favorable finance. So, the way I've lived it in particular has been, when I started renewable energy, and we're talking quite a while ago now, about 15 years ago, you were allowed relatively high leverage because the incentives were so high, and they were government-backed. So there were government incentives, and you got quite high. So typically feed-in tariffs or tax advantages in some countries. I particularly deal with a lot of feed-in tariffs, and it will allow you to really leverage the assets quite high, which has clearly as an equity investor was pretty, as it always has been part of the game, an important way to attract capital into that particular segment because you can have quite high returns. But this was about 15 years ago. I think as the markets developed, I think the cost of capital within renewable energy has decreased. We look at projects now, they're in the single-digit sort of returns, unlevered returns. And I think that's also changed a lot the type of investors which are going in. The banks have remained the same and consistent. If anything, the banks, I think, have got slightly better in some ways because now they're more open-minded. They used to be really restrictive on equipment. You have some wind turbines which wouldn't be financed. You have much worse terms. Whereas now it tends to be a little bit more, there's much more background and much more previous data to help with that. What has changed, I think, has been on the equity side. In my view, there's been a big move from higher sort of risk-reward players, which might be, as I said, private equity like we were in, to companies which are looking at much more stable but lower returns, such as infrastructure investment type returns. So for more traditional pension funds or insurance companies and so on. Now, the different stages of a project are now quite defined, I think, by their capital structures. So the early stages, development stages, is still potentially, you would see a lot of earlier, higher risk capital, and then once in a construction phase. But after the construction phase, typically it tends to be lower. So I think, in answer to your question, Chris, corporate finance has played a role in terms of we have seen the development and becoming mainstream of renewable energy. A lot, I think, because of the early investors.
The industry has matured and developed and it's gone through a natural life cycle, and we're now in a place where renewable energy is rightly seen as infrastructure. It was always infrastructure, but there was perceived technology risks, which some were real, some were not. And technology has certainly improved, particularly on the solar side. So yeah, it's very much mainstream now, and corporate financiers such as yourself have played a key role in moving us down that path. So now let's talk about the meat of the interview, your new sector. Could you please tell us about your new company, your new technology, and how you are impacting the climate change initiative for now?
So what we do as a company, what Brilliant Planet does as a company, we've developed our own technology to grow microalgae. So I always sort of jokingly tell people, imagine the things you don't want growing in between your bathroom tiles, those green things. That's actually what we're looking at growing. So people typically like algae, don't want them. In fact, they're pretty amazing species. So first of all, they've been around for billions of years and they're very evolved as a species. In themselves is really interesting because obviously they're microscopic, but they have a variety of properties around them which makes them very useful for many different things. So you can get food out of them, you can get oils out of them. And the other thing is they're a biomass. So they're like growing a tree. You're growing algae, it's like you're getting carbon dioxide from the air, and you're growing it with photosynthesis, light from the sun, and carbon dioxide from the air. You're basically growing algae. So what my company does is we have a specific terminology which allows us to bioprospect relevant algae for different specific end users. So for example, you say, I might want to have a product which is rich in protein. So we know what type of algae we can grow. So we'll have the best protein ratio. Similarly, we might want lipids. So again, similar with lipids. And also we cross-reference it with the amount of carbon they take from the atmosphere, the time it takes them to grow, the energy it takes to grow. So it's obviously a complex matrix, but this is kind of what we do. The other thing we do, and we have patents for, is the process of growing it. So algae have been growing naturally in the ocean for literally millions of years. And they just happen. But when you look at the history of making them grow artificially, it has traditionally been fraught with failure. So if you cast your mind back to, when I was studying the renewable energy industry around 2005, 2006, 2007, there were a lot of high-profile investments, for example, one called Sapphire Energy, which were in microalgae. And they were really looking at growing microalgae in a very synthetic way and competing when, oil was at a very high level. Obviously, oil has gone back out recently, but for the last 10 years, it hasn't quite been like that. And they were able to compete in a high oil price scenario as very specific fuels. So they were really using microalgae for biofuels. And the typical customers were, initially it was thought to be US aviation, US Air Forces, so for very specific uses. And the idea was that you could grow the algae independently and therefore mitigate any risks to do with oil producing countries. So
sounds great. We should go back there. We should get you say they're not in business anymore. What happened?
Well, what happened, and that's a problem, that's kind of where we came in a little bit, is that they had a very, as I said, synthetic process, very complex process, whereby they were taking algae from a library and growing it in very artificial synthetic situations. And that means you had to build around it a massive infrastructure. And a lot of the people which were in algae at the time were from the oil and gas industry, so they're used to expensive structures around them. So you had very expensive photobioreactors, you're importing carbon dioxide, pumping it in, you ended up having very high both investment costs and operational costs. And ultimately, if you look at the history, we all know what happened to oil prices about 10 years ago. They went down and they stayed low for a long time. And anyways, the product would have only been competitive if the oil prices kept on going up.
But there's generally a technology curve. Like people get better at doing it. So if this technology exists, these algae exist that can be producing a biofuel, why isn't there more money going into that to be reducing all these costs? That's the way things are. You spend more money in R&D, costs come down.
That's true. I think there were a lot of high-profile deaths, let me put it like this, of very important companies. A lot of very savvy investors got caught out, and I think that made people, like anything, like any boom and bust, makes people a little bit more wary about them. And we faced that quite a lot as well. So what we did is, as a company, we looked at our failures and we learned from them, and that's why we then moved to a very natural process. So instead of getting algae from a library and growing it synthetically in the middle of the desert, we actually grow the algae pretty much where it happens naturally. So we grow algae by the sea with a local species and in a natural environment. So what that means is that the algae naturally is ready to compete with its predators, which could be many other algae, fish, etc. So they can, when they're in a natural environment, you don't need to shelter them to grow them. They naturally exist, survival of the fittest. That's kind of how we've adopted the technology.
So you have just gone through a library of existing algae. You haven't tried to splice or dice or whatever. You've just taken and said that one has got properties that we like the look of. Its natural environment is here. We'll go and build a plant there to try and do it. So you built a demonstration plant, I understand. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. So just to clarify, we have our own library. We built our own library. So we have 1,200 species in our library. Mm-hmm. Right now we have a location in Morocco, off the coast in Morocco. It's a beautiful location in the middle of the desert. And it's perfect because obviously it's land with no alternate use, which makes it both not taking away from anything, from food or anything else, and obviously it comes with a relatively low cost.
But water, where do you get water if you're in the middle of a desert?
Well, we are on the coast. So the way our technology works is we need to be very close to the coast, on the coast. So we're about, our land finishes about 10 meters away from the coast. There's a road and then there's the coast. So what we do, we build a pipeline into the sea, into the ocean, and pump the water in. So it's at full scale, this becomes a project where you're effectively moving a lot of water in and out of an open system.
And then you build tanks and grow the algae in large tanks of water in the middle of a desert. That's okay.
In a basic format, that's correct, yeah. Yes. So the actual process itself, there's 3 phases to the process. We have a batch process, and every batch takes about 30 days from start to end. So in 30 days, we have a new batch coming online, and we harvest it and we have a final production. But the works, we start in the lab, and algae start. So think about, we have a multiplication system. So we start with 10 mil of water. We're now down to 10 mil, so we have 20. The day after, you have 20 and another 20, you have 40, and so on. So it's an exponential growth system. The algae are obviously multiplying during the daytime within the system. So we start with a lab with small amounts, and then after about 10 days, we move to the greenhouse area. So we're still relatively small, but we're now talking about 800 square meters within a greenhouse. Then that takes another 10 days, and we have several of these so-called Raceway ponds. So they're kind of elongated pools, in a way. And then we move to the outside area where we have the proper large-scale raceway ponds. And again, these are increasing in size every time they double. Our maximum size at the moment is 8,000 square meters, but when we'll be at the scale, will be 12,000 square meters. And you just imagine each one is 12,000 square meters. It's about a meter in depth, give or take. And then we have literally hundreds of these adjacent. So we have a so-called modular system where we grow the algae, including what I just said, the lab, the greenhouse, and the outside ponds. And this is like a module, and then you can sort of bolt on different modules to have a full-size growth production system. Now, for us, this is still in the future. At the moment, as you said, we have an operational plant. It's an operational pilot plant, and this has been really a prototype to allow us to explore and demonstrate the technology, demonstrate we can grow the algae, understand all the issues that come with it, because even though it's a simple natural process, there still obviously are a number of issues we need to explore. We are in the R&D phase.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. And so you're growing this, you've chosen this particular type of algae for particular properties. What properties are you encouraging? Why choose this one? That's not a biofuel, but what does it do?
Well, as I say, we have a large library, and within this library, we can select algae for different end uses. So we've been in this game as a company has been around for about 8 years, and we've evolved within this. So initially, as a company, we started looking at the fish meal substitute. So as part of the aquaculture industry, sort of obviously the food going for the salmon in our case in particular. And now we've evolved that thinking a little bit more towards other higher value food products and carbon removal. So we have two key markets which we're looking at the moment. The most important one for us, and obviously I think for our conversation, is carbon, so carbon removal. So we're looking at being an active participant towards supplying carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets, okay. So high quality credits, so which can be traced from start to finish, both in quantity, location, and certification. Historically, over the last few years, there has been sometimes a question about were these genuine projects would have happened anyways, yeah. Or are there additional projects? And we're really focusing on demonstrating that part. So we're specifically on new projects to remove carbon from the atmosphere.
And do you want to talk a little bit more about carbon markets and how they work? Because it's a fascinating world, and it'll be increasingly important if we're trying to get to net zero.
Carbon markets have been around for many years, obviously. There have been a number of, I would say, false starts in carbon markets. So, when I started looking at voluntary carbon markets, prices were about $50 a ton, and a year after they were zero and pretty much stayed zero. Then obviously there's all the non-voluntary carbon markets, like the EU ETS scheme, which have been traditionally, carbon markets are a contentious point, I think, for many people. And a lot of people will debate whether we should have a carbon tax, and I'm not going to get into that. But the markets which were mandated by, for example, in Europe, which gave specific targets, but then they input a lot of carbon credits, and therefore meant the prices were zero. So they didn't really take off as expectations.
Yeah. Well, that has changed a bit recently, though.
Well,
yeah.
So that's historically. I think if you cast your eye to the last 3 or 4 years, I would say that instead has been really picking up. Well, because it changed the structure, so there's actually many less carbon credits going into those markets. Okay. And the other thing which we're seeing, and it's really where we are acting, as I said, is the voluntary carbon market. So a lot of companies, big companies, are keen really to show that they are working towards decarbonizing, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, obviously you would say, stop producing, and you don't produce anything, but that would be counterproductive, clearly. So I think it's really interesting because companies are looking at ways they can do that. I think it's a multi-pronged strategy. So on the one hand, clearly they're being more conscious about the energy they use, reducing use of energy, but at the same time, there's going to be a base load effectively, which they're not able to cut. So then what can they do to then offset their carbon usage? And that's where people like us would come in, the voluntary carbon credits. So a company, everyone likes to use the example of Microsoft and Google and these big corporate sort of technology firms. which are really actively looking at how they can reduce them. Those are the kind of markets which we'll be looking at to start off with, because these companies understand, and a lot of companies are going to try and reach their goals towards 2030. Interestingly, a lot of corporate consulting companies, for example, are quite active in these markets as well. They're really looking at ways of reducing the carbon footprint. And an important aspect has been this distinction of the high quality credits. What is a genuine credit that really is carbon dioxide, genuinely traceable, removed. You can trace it and you can see it's been removed, and you can go identify where it's buried, as opposed to sometimes there are projects which are a little bit less clear exactly of how that carbon was removed. I think there's going to be I would say a flight to quality in terms of carbon credits. And the corporates are going to be looking for, high quality credits, and that's where we are aiming to be, and that's where we expect to be.
One of the trickiest problems now is certification. There's lots of people who are out there trying to certify, and there's a mixture of quality amongst them. I'd imagine that there'll be 2 or 3 champions, winners ultimately in the game. But how do you go about how you're thinking about your own certification process? Have you started to be putting yourself through the accreditation process with these guys?
To be very honest with you, we're just starting that. So at the moment, we're still at the stage where we're evaluating the different companies which provide this service. As you said, there's a number of companies which provide it, but I think there's a few, I would say 3 key players which we'll be looking at. On the one hand, have the conversations and the agreements with these companies to come and certify, and this is what our clients already are requesting, so we're aware of this. On the other hand, when you look at our production system, even though it's a nature-based, relatively simple procedure, we're actually very tech savvy, very tech conscious. So in the production system, from the design phase, which we're now on a large scale, we're really looking at integrating sensors and measurements and having a very clear idea of the volume, and from the volume we can then figure out the mass in the different stages of our production, and making sure that we quantify and qualify all our productions.
And what's your special sauce? Because if you're taking particular types of bugs and putting them into essentially seawater, salt water, what's to stop someone else just going, oh, that's a good idea, we'll do that?
Well, they're welcome to join the party. I mean, we've been doing this for 8 years, and even though again it's simple, it's still obviously like any research and development activity might look simple when it's done. But there's a lot that goes behind it. So, just the bioprospecting, the understanding of growth. So we do a lot of analysis of the growth cycle, and to understand what is actually motivating the algae, they're called diatoms, the atoms to grow, what impact light has on them, what impact heat has on them. This is all a scientific process, which obviously takes a fair amount of observation and analysis before we get it. We're constantly evolving this thinking, by the way.
Yeah. And you have a lab around the corner from here in Camden.
Yes.
What are the differences you've noticed from the lab environment in Camden to a desert environment, and the other side of the world?
Okay, so I need to remind you, I'm not a scientist, so I'm mostly to do with the finance aspects. But I think I would do a disservice to my colleagues on the science side. And as a company, we're 15 now, and we have about 10 people in the science side, and then 5 people, including myself, on the business side. So they would be able to give a much better response. But when we're outside, the biggest difference is predators. So when you're in a lab, you don't have predators. So you're growing things in a safe, closed environment. When you're outside, you have predators. And it could be, as I said, there could be fish, there could be other algae, there could be other species in the water, there could be birds, there could be both in terms of birds getting the algae, but also defecating in the algae. And the key thing for us has been, when we are in the lab, we have a protected environment. That's why I'll go take you back to our 3-stage production process. Think about the algae as children. When they're young and small, you keep them nice and safe in a nice, safe environment, typically, and trying to grow them and teach them how to behave. And that's what we do in the lab. Then when we're a little bit larger, we put them in university, which is the greenhouses. So they're already finding their own feet. And then we put them out in the big bad world, which are the outside ponds, and by that time they can fend for themselves. But that's a simple way from a business perspective of sort of explaining the impact on that.
Thank you. So Morocco must have been a really interesting place to set up. Could you tell us a little bit about the cooperation that you have from local governments, and also the various challenges you're bound to have come across?
Morocco is a great place to be. We actually started a partnership with the Moroccan government as part of COP22. Okay. So in COP22, and by that time we already had a relationship with the Moroccan government, but the Moroccan government basically saw our project as part of their commitment towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. As you might probably know, Morocco has also heavily invested in wind energy, and also a large extent to solar energy. But for example, adjacent to our land and of interest to you and me, given my background, there's a lot of very high capacity, large scale, 300 megawatt, 450 megawatt wind production sites. But specifically to us, as I said, our relationship started with COP22, and we were part of the solution that the government saw. And as part of that, we had a very strong support from the Moroccan government at the highest levels. We had, in the company, we have a very high-ranking person in part of our local company, which has obviously helped us a lot in developing the relationships and being part of understanding the local nuances, which I think is very important always to have local partners which really understand and are able to help you navigate all the differences. I mean, Morocco, for example, is a very bureaucratic country. You have a lot of bureaucracy about doing a lot of things, but the important thing is doing them the right way and being aware of them, and then you can obviously navigate that. But if you come there, like in any business, with expectation from London, you'll be surprised at what you find on site. And that goes, I think, for any development business really in natural resources. But as I said, we've had a lot of support from a lot of government agencies in Morocco. For example, the aquaculture agency, which even though aquaculture typically is linked with growth of fish, in our case actually means because we're dealing with water, because we're bringing water, so we still fall within the aquaculture section. And also other government agencies, local, all the way down to the local legislation.
Mm-hmm. Any advice that you could give to other people who are thinking of, stepping out into the entrepreneurial venture and this type of deep lab science technology type of industry?
Well, I think first of all, I would say do it. I think for me, it's one thing I see coming from a sort of corporate sort of finance background, investor background. I think there's a lot of capital, especially these days, looking for good projects. And in reality, when I was sitting on the investor side, it was one of the challenges is because we had the capital, but finding the right project is always a difficult aspect. As an entrepreneur, if you're going to be developing such a project, I think then what you need to do is to be able to show that yours is a good project. So obviously, there's the initial bits that go without saying, which are probably the hardest ones, is do you have the right technology, are you delivering the right thing? But I think to me, and what has worked for us, we are proposing a large-scale solution to climate change. What investors in particularly like about us is the potential for scale. What we do is great, but if we do it at a small scale, it'll be just an interesting project, and you might get one ultra high net worth individual backing you, but that's going to be the end of that. So I think for me, the main thing would be, if you're an entrepreneur looking at it, is really think about your scalability in the problem you're addressing and making sure that it is a scalable problem. And it applies with pretty much, the same applies with a SaaS investment in software, what is the scalability of it? So it's a similar thing. And one interesting thing I've noticed in recent times is a lot of the traditional venture capitalists and early stage tech investors are now growing and putting together and opening and starting new climate tech funds. And that's very much where we are. And that's, in fact, we've recently had investment exactly on the back of that. And I think a lot of traditional investors are now much more open to climate tech as part of the solution towards climate crisis. So there's a lot of capital moving and chasing projects. But again, they'll be looking at the things which are, what is the problem is solving? Is it a scalable solution? And then obviously all the other things which in a typical VC investment will go like, is this the right team or in the right place? And and then have they done the right things to date?
So the conversation so far has been very much on carbon capture and storage. So you grow algae, it takes CO2 out as it grows, then you desiccate it and bury it. Yeah, so that's it captured. But the other part of what you were talking about was well, you grow this particular algae for a particular reason.
Correct. Yeah.
And has particular chemical properties. Our conversation has been very much about the carbon capture and storage rather than the chemical properties.
So interestingly, when the company was started, it was started on the back of a patent, and the patent is called Method of Carbon Sequestration. Oh, wow. So interesting enough, a little backstory, our chief scientist, Dr. Jovine, who's come up with the technology, he initially started developing the technology in response to there's a Virgin Challenge many years ago now, about 10 years ago, which was, can you come up with a method of removing, I think it was 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And that was the challenge.
That was Richard Branson, yeah?
Richard Branson's challenge, correct. So in effect, no one won. But that's what started, our company, and that's the first patent that was put down, that was registered for, was method of carbon sequestration. Now, it's been an interesting journey because as a startup, obviously you pivot and change and you adapt and you survive. And at one point, we moved more towards, as you say, the properties of that. So algae, without boring you, but algae is a super interesting as a system because it allows for growing many different things. So you can grow food from algae, you can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you can use it for many different things. You can use it for cement, you can use it for egg white substitute, for example, in industrial processes. You can really do a lot of stuff with it. So the chemical properties of the algae are obviously key important. But then as one of the challenges we faced is, sure, we can do a lot of different things with the same basic algae. Now we have different strains which will grow with different properties, but we can actually do many things. Do I use type 1 and type 2, type 3? Each one will give me a slightly different product. Which one do I pick? But the question is really what market do I want to be in, obviously. So you need to think about your end market. Now, for us, as I mentioned, we are in the carbon market, but we're also in the secondary market, which is actually, in a way, a more interesting market. And we are in the sustainable foods market. In particular, we're looking at beta-carotene. So beta-carotene is an ingredient that goes into many foods. It's a kind of colorant in the industrial process. And we look at how it's produced now, it's produced, again, in a synthetic way, mostly. So like many other ingredients in our food, companies which produce it are looking at having more sustainable ways of producing it. A, because from a sort of sustainability perspective, CO2 reduction. B, from a resourcing perspective, so they want to have multiple choices when we're looking at sourcing it. And C, when they look at the properties of what is in it, obviously a natural solution typically is slightly better than a non-natural solution. So, one of the other markets we're developing and which we can develop is, as I said, beta-carotene.
Why use beta-carotene when you can be replacing motor fuel?
Well, so one thing to realize, obviously, petrol prices right now are in a bit of a flux as we speak, but for the past number of years, they've been relatively somewhat stable, even though obviously stably increasing slowly. So there's a couple of key things there. A, we're growing something, so we'd rather try not to burn it, because it goes against our kind of sustainability credentials. So that's one big part. And the other part is, we can use that as food. And within the food markets, without getting into the specifics of dollars or pricing, but some food markets, for example, beta-carotene are actually very lucrative. So for us, it's a very small percentage what we can produce goes into that market. But within that sliver, and it's not a big market, but it's still a very profitable market. So we decided to focus our product on that because we're a startup. We have startup costs, we have development costs. We've been spending years in R&D, so we need somehow to cover this. We can't compete with a commoditized product. So, for example, when we looked at for instance, fish meal replacement, we've been substituting mostly for something like soybean. I mean, soybean is a commoditized product. It trades at very established. I mean, there's different markets within soy, but at the end of the day, they're within a relatively small margin of each other. And we couldn't really compete with those. We don't, we have startup costs, we're new technology. Soy has been around for many, many years, so we couldn't really compete. So we had to focus on the markets which would allow us to develop the technology. It doesn't mean in the future we don't do that, but right now, as we approach the market, that's the first markets we're going to go into.
So you've already been operating for, what you said, 8 years?
As a company, we've been for 8 years.
8 years, wow.
So I think the way we look at it now, we believe we're going to be into full-scale, large-scale production about 5 years from now. So we've now just closed a Series A fundraise. This fundraise will take us to about 12, 18 months runway, upon which we'll do a Series B fundraise. The Series B fundraise will deliver a full-size commercial-scale pilot plant. So we have the small-scale pilot plant already operational. We're going to do a full-size commercial-scale pilot plant, and then we'll have a so-called Series C. It won't be a Series C as such, but if you think about it as a Series C, to then build a full-size commercial-scale facility. How we size that will also depend a little bit on how we structure the capital. But at the moment, we're looking at having probably about $150 million dollar project. As I mentioned earlier, we have a modular sort of system. So when you think about the Series B, it's going to deliver the first module. We then take this module and multiply it 5, 10 times for the Series C. And that's how we look at scaling it. So as we go along, we're trying to de-risk every step of the way, and that's clearly what investors need. And any investor loves to have a de-risk project, clearly. So what we're trying to do is, right now, we're de-risking a number of elements, I guess, with the company, with the product. Next step will to be de-risk the production at full scale. So showing that we can do this consistently at a large scale. And by that point, then we'll be able to then move to the full scale production when we hopefully will have, at least surprises as we go along. Again, keep in mind, it's new technology. I wouldn't say it's experimental because all the things we use are known and there's nothing implicitly so new about it, but it's still putting it all together in a new shape or form is always clearly, there's always newness to that, and you come across hundreds of different things which you don't have foreseen. Typical, like the same with any sort of, I guess, even infrastructure project, you think about it. And I think when I think about it in the long term, so, as I said, it will be about 5 years before we start having full-scale commercial production. But if you look at it in the long term, I really think that we're going to become, again, like an infrastructure type investment in terms of the risk and in terms of the kind of capital. So it came very similar to the story which I came from, which is we start from right now we're in a venture capital money, so we see high risk but at high return sort of money. And as we go along that journey, the capital and the capital providers, I'm forecasting, will be changing from what are now at the moment are venture capital or grants, government backing, that kind of stuff, to commercial equity, commercial debt, and long-term infrastructure type debt. So, from pension funds and so on. And these are relatively long-term projects as well.
The continual hamster wheel of running around fundraising, which is typical with big infrastructure projects and big technology projects.
Well, there's as you say, some people sometimes say, fundraising is not a business model. So, but at the moment, it is for us a fund. That is not necessarily the business model because we have a clear idea of what markets and what project and how we're going to do it. But at the moment, we still have to go through those hoops, as any project.
Yeah. So you're sitting here 8 years in with another 5 years to go. I wonder what the founders, thought. Did they think it was going to be a 10-year program? And you sitting here, kind of mid-cycle in your own career. With the company before you're on full production, still 10 years of your life. Like how do you kind of psychologically prepare for that? How do you prepare for that in terms of the finances of the business? I think you've already covered, but really more kind of psychologically, how do you think I'm going to be involved in this for the next 10 years?
So in terms of how do we prepare for what is a long-term journey as an entrepreneurial company, I think that's that has several challenges. I think a little bit depends on what kind of person you are and what you're ready to take on as even from a career perspective, from a personal perspective. Obviously you're in a company which you're always looking at 12 months cash burn kind of thing, and that's kind of my job. I look at, how much cash do we have, when are we going to run out, when do we need more, what are the levers to pull. So on the one hand, very, very conscious of that because it's my day to day. And at the same time, I think, you have to have a bit of faith in terms of you're going to be able to go to the next stage. How do you go to the next stage is you have to be very clear on being efficient with your runway and being sure that the money you're using is actually going to give you a proper result. The money you're using is going to be able to deliver the results you need in order to go to the next stage. The other thing is, obviously, when you're in a startup, clearly you're getting maybe smaller compensation, but then you're also compensated with shares and part of the ownership. And I think that's also, again, goes down to the kind of person you are, whether you're willing to take that risk and whether you are, that is the kind of things that works for you. So you're really betting your own career on the future of the company. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, I think if you're going to a large company and someone like NG, for example, which is a great company, very established, very, very stable perhaps, and you're going to go into a certain type of company, have a certain type of role. If you're in a startup, you're having many more roles and you can really help shape it. So I think it's a little bit, a personal choice, and it kind of comes with the territory. So I would almost argue that when you get into it, you should already know that, you should set yourself up mentally for this might not work out, but I'm trying it and it's going to keep on going at it, and I'm going to keep on being tenacious about it and scrappy about it. And then comes a point when you can be less scrappy, be less tenacious, well, always tenacious, but less scrappy and be a bit more professional. And that's kind of the stage we are at as a company now. We're kind of moving from that scrappy early stage to a little bit more corporate, a little bit more structured, a little bit more poised for growth, really thinking about what's actually going to make us deliver our next goal. So, from scrappy company, no systems, now we're putting a system in place, policies in place, implementing a clear structure, getting proper advisors in place, really structuring the company, because then you can grow to the, it's going to be more and more important as we get more capital into the company, to have a company which can accommodate that capital and which will effectively, when you get investors, they'll get the reassurance that the company is properly run. I think that's a big important step in our growth.
And just on that point, do you see that the world has changed recently?
Well, I think obviously there's a lot of geopolitics at play at the moment. There's a few things there. One is, I don't think that the climate change problem is going to go away. And for my part, I'm still looking, I'm still part of that solution. So that's not going to go away. It might get worse, perhaps, as companies and governments trying to refocus their energy matrix. What does that mean? Are they going to move to more oil, more gas? Or going to move to more nuclear, for example? Small nuclear, for example, could be a solution, right? I mean, there's several solutions which are on the table, which at the moment it's hard to say, as an energy matrix, and what the geopolitics of those are going to have. But even when you look at, for example, electric vehicles and batteries and storage, those have got their own underlying geopolitics. So countries like, Congo, Australia, Chile come more into the mix. So we might be changing dynamics in countries, but those underlying problems will just be shifting from one country to another. And the solution will be fluid, I guess, but it'll still be a solution that needs to be managed.
Yeah, but talking to you as the corporate finance here, and you say you're not an economist, but you do have a MBA from London Business School. So interest rates are on an upward trend, inflation's on an upward trend. How do you then deal with the increased cost of capital as a corporate finance guy?
Well, so these obviously are all risks which we need to be aware of. I think they're developing. We've been kind of had the luxury over the last 15 to 20 years to have a low interest world. The predictions have been always that they'll be going up, and now we're finally seeing that. I think it's going to obviously have an impact on the equity side, clearly to my mind. As when I think of a corporate finance structure, typically equity versus debt, the debt's going to become more expensive, and it's going to eat into what I would say a low return equity projects. So, it will have repercussions across the chain. So I think it's going to be a question of how do we adapt, and how do investors deploy their capital, and where do they deploy it?
Yeah, it is the $1 trillion question,
Yeah.
you know, in this new world. So, Riccardo, I think if we're finally going to be, wrapping up this conversation, it's been fantastic. Thank you. Could we kind of focus in on kind of one last point? There's a lot of work going into this, into the whole climate change area, and there's dozens and dozens of micro aspects where people can be getting involved in this part of that bit if you're passionate about climate change. Why should someone who is, like in London Business School studying, or someone who's sitting at home with some money in their pocket wondering where they should be investing, or someone who's just thinking about it, making a career change, why should they be considering, going into the space that you are, which is taking in your corporate finance skills and the skills that you had, but moving into this very, very interesting but niche market?
Well, I think there's a wider sort of ethical question, and clearly there's many discussions around climate change, and there's the believers, the non-believers. I would say I myself would sit within the believers side, clearly as demonstrated by my career, what I've been focusing on, delivering, what I believe in. And, once you take that as a given, to my mind, personally, it's a responsibility towards future generations. That's why I do it conceptually. I do believe a lot in legacy. So to me, that would be my legacy. So that's why I decided to spend my time doing this rather than something else. So obviously that's a personal thing. I think a lot of people could probably relate to that. I think if you then think about it a little bit more, maybe pragmatically, there's a lot of funding searching not many projects, many quality projects. So, I think, I'm not saying that if you start a company like this, you will necessarily hit gold straight away. It's not an easy journey. It's pretty tough. We've been through the hard bits as well as the good bits. But I think what I would say is that to the community is try and be part of a solution. And to me, this is being part of a solution. We're one of many solutions to climate change. We are removing carbon from the atmosphere. Before, I was generating energy from clean sources, and there's many other ways in between, hundreds of different businesses in climate tech, climate venture, blockchain for renewable energy, you name it. I mean, electric vehicles, storage, green hydrogen, there's so many different solutions. I think each one of these, in my opinion, presents what are really relevant businesses for today, which solve a genuine problem, and which are a genuine, relevant problem we're solving.
Well, Riccardo, that was a great note to end on. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. It was fascinating. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on that conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you learned something. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to leave a 5-star review and to subscribe to any of our channels, and we'll be sure to keep you updated on future productions. This series is produced by United Renewables in collaboration with the London Business School Alumni Energy Club.